Okay, so if we now know we got 3% of the people that impact 90%, the question is, of course, what about the leaders? How much do they impact? And if we look to the leaders, they typically, and that is if we include people managers, they typically account for about 3% of the employee population, and they impact between 40 and 50% of the people. So if you only work through top down, as one crow asked me to do yesterday, you're going to miss out on half of the employees. It's going to be like flipping the coin to succeed with your change. So I strongly advise you not to do that. I'm not saying you shouldn't work with the leadership. I'm going to tell you afterwards what you should do, but you also need to work with the informal networks. And here's one reason why you should work with the informal networks. This is a 5,000 person company in the communication sector. And in this case here, I've removed all the leaders. And even though I've removed all the leaders, you can see there's a lot going on here. You got a lot of people connecting to each other. You almost can't see it, right? It's like one big dust ball. But these are people just connecting to each other outside the leadership or around the leaders here. It's happening every single day. I mean, the 3% and the informal networks, they are there regardless if you work with them. Okay, so if we now have identified these people, the 3% that impact 90%, the question is, of course, what do we do with them? I mean, and this is where you can really learn from your volunteering experiences, right? Because you need to activate them. I mean, they will not work on your behalf just because you tell them to. So there's an activation process happening. Then there is, and it is a lot about building trust and stuff like that, making sure you actually listen to them. I'll get back to that. Then when you've activated them, you can actually engage them. And then where most people actually fail is what I call step 4, because then they forget about them. They forget that those people have the influence now, they have worked with them. But I mean, the influence is not disappearing just because you're not talking to them anymore. Their influence is still there afterwards. So don't do that mistake, right? Make sure you actually engage with them. And how is it then for step 2 and 3, the activation and the engagement? I typically draw up a 2x2. You already see now that I like 2x2s. That's a classic consulting thing. We have the craziest winter parties in Innovisor where we stand and draw stupid 2x2s with who scores the most goals and hair links and I don't know, crazy things. Whatever we can come up with. In this case, it's more classic. It is formal to the left, informal to the right, structured at the top, unstructured at the bottom. And we talk about how do we engage the formal structures, We have the structured part, which is about the leadership communication. It might be intranet communication. It might be newsletters. It might be town hall meetings. All of that, which you probably have people working for you to do, right? You have to keep on doing that. Because it's important. In the bottom left quadrant, this is where the leaders go when they're done with the town hall meetings, where you want them to role model what you're trying to achieve. Also important. I'm assuming you're also doing that today, making sure the leaders are standing up for your change and speaking its case, etc. Otherwise, we have a small problem here as well. So leadership communication and role modeling is happening in the formal quadrant. Of course, there are other things happening here, but I mean, those two things are really key. Then in the structured informal quadrant, this is where the 3% become really, really important. If you know them by name, you can actually listen to them. And I always say, listen, listen, and listen. Don't dictate what you're trying to get them to think, right? You need to listen to them so you actually gain their trust. If you gain their trust, you might be able to convince them to co-create activities with you. Or maybe even take responsibility for some of your activities, your change activities. And you want to do that because you want to turn them into insiders. When they are insiders, that's the best place you can get them to be. because then they help you out when they talk to their colleagues, because in the bottom right quadrant, that's where you have all the other people, all the other employees, and they try to make sense of what they hear from the top leaders at the town hall meeting and on the internet, etc., and from how the leaders are role modeling, etc. But above all, they look to the peers that they trust the most to make sense of it. And it's when all of that makes sense that the change happens. Change doesn't happen until it makes sense. And you might have heard this thing also from Edelman Trust Barometer, where they say that peers are more trusted than leaders, and this is exactly the case. It's also the reason why I'm sometimes referring to a quote from Abraham Lincoln, where he said, "To persuade the undecided, send in someone they trust, not we trust, but they trust." And this is the key in working with informal networks. Don't think you know who it is that people trust. Ask the people. So, I mean, of course, you can employ fancy analytics like we do, but the other thing you can do is just start to ask people, who is it that they go to when they want to have help, or who is it that they go to if they want to get some energy, etc., right? So you just start to understand the networks. Just ask those questions. It has got nothing to do with informal networks. What it has got a thing to do with, but it's just when you are doing your change, I just want to make sure you do remember this. Face-to-face is just better. It's like, according to HBR, 34 times more impactful than emails. Again, if I refer back to this session I was in 2 weeks ago, I asked people, how many of you are receiving too many emails? And I had 100% raising their hands and saying that they were getting too many emails. When I then asked, so how many of you are sending too many emails? I had no hands. I think we are all sending too many emails, and we could be better off just walking over and talking to people, or use the principle that I call wakama, which is walk over to talk to people. And if you can't walk over, then call them so you hear the voice. And the very last option is actually to send an email. So the map, that one.